The phrase "a new Napoleon has arisen in Germany" is more than a dramatic metaphor. It is a historical lens through which contemporaries attempted to make sense of a sudden, unsettling concentration of power in the heart of Europe. When Adolf Hitler rose from political obscurity to national leadership with astonishing speed, many observers, both within Germany and abroad, searched the past for a comparable figure. Napoleon Bonaparte became the most powerful and immediate analogy. This comparison was not merely rhetorical flourish. It reflected a deeper intellectual and psychological effort to interpret a new political phenomenon, using the most familiar template for revolutionary authority, charismatic command, and imperial ambition. To understand why Hitler was seen by many as a potential new Napoleon, it is to uncover how historical memory, myth, and political fear interact when societies confront unprecedented change. Napoleon's legacy occupied a single place in European consciousness. He embodied the collapse of an old order, the rise of a new political energy, and the transformation of a disordered nation into a disciplined engine of power. By the early 20th century, Napoleon had become an archetype rather than merely a historical figure. The outsider who rises through chaos, fuses ideology with military force, reorganizes the state, defeats rivals with speed and audacity, and reshapes the entire continental balance of power. When Germany entered a period of profound instability following defeat, economic collapse, and social fragmentation, the reappearance of this archetype in public imagination was almost inevitable. The analogy to Napoleon was not imposed arbitrarily on Hitler. It emerged because the structural conditions that had once produced Napoleon appeared to be reforming. Hitler's appeal during his rise rested on a convergence of crisis and promise. Germany was marked by disorientation, institutional weakness, mass resentment, depravity, and a pervasive sense of national humiliation. Political authority appeared fractured, traditional elites seemed ineffective, and democratic mechanisms struggled to command any form of legitimacy. Within this context, Hitler presented himself not simply as a politician, but as an embodiment of will, motion, and purpose. This was precisely how Napoleon had been perceived in revolutionary France. Observers who spoke of a new Napoleon were therefore not only recognizing similarities in personal ambition, but also diagnosing a deeper structural repetition. A nation in distress turning toward extraordinary authority. The Napoleon comparison carried a dual meaning from the outset: admiration and fear. For some, Napoleon symbolized restoration through force, the ending of political paralysis, the reassertion of national pride, and the reorganization of society along disciplined lines. For others, he symbolized unrestrained militarism, endless war, and eventual continental catastrophe. When Hitler began demonstrating his capacity to mobilize mass support, to neutralize rivals, and to centralize authority with startling efficiency, both interpretations of the Napoleon myth reactivated simultaneously. The comparison expressed not certainty, but unease. An intuition that Europe was again entering a historical phase dominated by singular power. One reason the analogy gained such traction was Hitler's rapid consolidation of authority. Within a remarkably short period, he transformed a fragile constitutional system into a centralized state structured around personal loyalty and ideological conformity. Napoleon had accomplished something similar by converting revolutionary instability into imperial order. Both figures moved from the margins of political life into its center with extraordinary velocity, giving the impression of inevitability. To contemporaries, speed itself became proof of historical force. The faster authority accumulated, the more it seemed driven by destiny rather than circumstance. This perception of inevitability was central to the new Napoleon narrative. Equally important was the relationship between leadership and mass psychology. Napoleon and Hitler both understood in different ways that authority in modern societies flows not only from institutions, but from emotional identification. Each cultivated an image that transcended ordinary political categories. Supporters did not merely vote for them, they believed in them. The sense that history itself was moving through a single individual was integral to the comparison. When Hitler spoke of national rebirth, renewal, and historical mission, many listeners did not hear mere rhetoric. They heard an echo of earlier epochs, in which a solitary figure seemed to carry the fate of a nation on his shoulders. The philosophical dimension of the Napoleon analogy also rests on a shared attitude toward law and authority. Napoleon had arisen as a product of revolution, yet ultimately subordinated revolutionary chaos to centralized command. He preserved the language of popular legitimacy while hollowing it into a tool of personal rule. Hitler's rise followed a similarly paradoxical path. He used existing legal mechanisms to dismantle them from within. To contemporaries steeped in European history, this method felt unmistakably Napoleonic. It suggested the return of a type of leadership that does not openly destroy law at first, but gradually absorbs it into the will of a single authority. Another element strengthening the comparison was the use of national humiliation as political fuel. Napoleon rose from a France threatened by invasion, surrounded by hostile monarchies, and burdened with internal instability. His victories were interpreted as acts of collective redemption. Hitler likewise positioned himself as the agent of national restoration, transforming perceived weakness into a narrative of resurgence. Observers who drew the Napoleonic parallel recognized in this strategy a familiar rhythm. Defeat gives way to revival, revival to conquest. The phrase "a new Napoleon has arisen" thus expressed not just the appearance of a strong leader, but the perceived reactivation of a historical cycle driven by wounded pride and aggressive renewal. International reactions to Hitler's rise further reinforced the Napoleonic analogy. Foreign governments, intellectuals, and journalists struggled to classify the new German leader within existing political categories. He did not fit comfortably into the models of traditional conservatism, parliamentary liberalism, or even earlier forms of authoritarianism. Napoleon, however, offered a ready-made interpretive frame, a revolutionary strongman who transcended ideology in favor of personal authority and national destiny. By calling Hitler a new Napoleon, observers elevated him above ordinary politicians and placed him within a lineage of continental disruptors, whose actions could not be contained within the usual rules of diplomacy. Yet the analogy was never exact, and its limitations reveal as much as its appeal. Napoleon was above all a military tactician of genius who rose through battlefield success. His authority was forged primarily through direct command of armed forces. Hitler, by contrast, rose through ideological mobilization, mass politics, and institutional manipulation long before achieving military dominance. This difference mattered profoundly. The Napoleon analogy risked oversimplifying a new type of power that fused modern propaganda, bureaucratic control, and total mobilization in ways unknown to the early 19th century. Still, the fact that the comparison persisted demonstrates how deeply the Napoleonic archetype shaped the European imagination of power. The phrase also reveals the enduring belief that history is moved by exceptional individuals rather than by impersonal systems. To say that a new Napoleon had arisen was to imply that one will could once again redirect an entire continent's destiny. This belief was contested even at the time, yet it remains psychologically persuasive. When institutions appear weak and social forces seem too chaotic, the appearance of a concentrated authority feels clarifying. The comparison to Napoleon thus expressed a longing for intelligible history, for an identifiable actor who could be held responsible for the direction of events rather than an abstract web of structures. At a deeper philosophical level, the Napoleon analogy reflects the modern tension between freedom and order. Napoleon emerged at the conclusion of a revolutionary upheaval. He brought stability, but at the cost of personal freedom and political plurality. Hitler's rise was likewise interpreted by some as a dramatic restoration of order after years of instability. The comparison therefore carried an implicit philosophical wager, that societies in crisis may accept the suspension of ordinary freedoms in exchange for coherence, direction, and collective purpose. To name a new Napoleon was to acknowledge that this trade-off had once again become politically attractive. The emotional power of the analogy was intensified by its tragic dimension. Napoleon's career followed a narrative arc that seemed almost classical in structure. Meteoric rise, overwhelming dominance, catastrophic overreach, and an ultimate downfall. This pattern was deeply embedded in cultural memory. Those who spoke of a new Napoleon did not merely mean another conqueror. They also implied the inevitability of excess and collapse. The phrase functioned as a form of historical foreshadowing. It suggested that another dramatic rise might already contain within it the seeds of a devastating fall. This tragic dimension helps explain why the comparison was used both by admirers and by critics. To supporters, the phrase evoked strength, renewal, and national rebirth. To skeptics, it was a warning invoked precisely because Napoleon's empire ultimately ended in ruin. The same historical image could therefore be deployed to justify expectation or to express dread. In this way, the phrase "a new Napoleon has arisen in Germany" became a symbolic battlefield in its own right, shaped by the hopes and fears of those who used it. The comparison also illustrates how historical analogies shape political behavior. By interpreting Hitler through a Napoleonic lens, contemporaries implicitly expected certain patterns: territorial ambition, continental reordering, and inevitable conflict with rival powers. These expectations influenced diplomatic calculations, military preparations, and public discourse. History did not simply repeat itself. It was actively used as a script through which new actions were interpreted and anticipated. The analogy contributed to a self-reinforcing logic in which leaders and observers alike came to believe they were living through a familiar historical drama. At the same time, the analogy obscured key differences. Napoleon operated in an age of dynastic warfare and emerging nation-states. Hitler's rise unfolded in a world already shaped by mass politics, industrial warfare, and global interdependence. By layering an early 19th century framework onto a 20th century reality, observers risked misunderstanding the new scale and nature of power that was emerging. The very persistence of the Naples comparison thus reveals both the usefulness and the danger of historical analogy. It clarifies by association, yet distorts by oversimplification. The idea of a new Napoleon also illuminates the relationship between charisma and crisis. Charismatic authority rarely appears in stable conditions. It thrives where institutional legitimacy has eroded and where collective anxiety seeks embodiment. Hitler's rise was inseparable from such conditions. The comparison with Napoleon therefore points less to the uniqueness of either figure and more to the recurring social mechanisms that make such figures possible. It suggests that the true continuity lies not in personality, traits, but in the structural vulnerability of societies to the promise of decisive leadership. Another reason the analogy endured was the aesthetic dimension of power. Napoleon consciously staged his authority through ritual, imagery, and symbolism. He understood that spectacle was inseparable from sovereignty in the modern age. Hitler too relied heavily on visual and ceremonial reinforcement of authority. The pageantry of mass rallies, uniforms, and choreographed displays echoed the imperial aesthetics associated with Napoleon. Observers who witnessed these spectacles naturally reached for the most powerful precedent available. The new regime did not merely wield power, it performed it, as Napoleon had done more than a century earlier. From a broader historical perspective, the phrase, "a new Napoleon has arisen in Germany," illustrates how modern Europe remained haunted by its own past. Napoleon was not simply remembered as a man, but as a mythic threshold between the old world and the modern state. Each time a similar concentration of power appeared, his image re-emerged like a ghost summoned by political crisis. To perceive Hitler as a new Napoleon was therefore to interpret the present as a return to a familiar structural drama, the rebirth of an empire in an age that claimed to have outgrown it. Crucially, the analogy also reflects the limits of human foresight. Those who invoked Napoleon could not fully anticipate the unprecedented scale and nature of the catastrophe that would follow. They sensed danger, ambition, and continental disruption, but they interpreted these through the known vocabulary of 19th century imperialism. In doing so, they underestimated 20th century technology, industrial capacity, and ideological mobilization would transform the consequences of such concentrated power. The comparison thus stands as an example of how historical memory both warns and conceals. In the end, the quote, "A new Napoleon has arisen in Germany," captures a moment when Europe, confronted with a rapidly ascending authoritarian figure, turned instinctively to its deepest historical precedent for meaning. The comparison reveals how observers understood Hitler not merely as a national leader, but as a continental force, a figure whose influence might reorder the entire balance of power as radically as Napoleon once had. It expresses both awe at the velocity of transformation and dread at the likely trajectory of such power. The phrase does not indicate that history literally repeated itself, but rather that it rhymed in structure and perception. It shows how societies interpret danger through old narratives, how myth shapes political understanding, and how the memory of past upheavals remains embedded in the collective imagination. To call Hitler a new Napoleon was to situate his rise within a long philosophical tradition that associates crisis with the emergence of a singular authority, that equates national redemption with personal command, and that accepts the tragic cycle of rise and fall as the price of historical transformation. Ultimately, the enduring power of this comparison lies in what it reveals about humans' attempts to find order in upheaval. The invocation of Napoleon was not simply an analytical judgment, it was a psychological act of recognition. It was a way of saying that Europe had seen this pattern before, that it knew something about the shape of what was unfolding, and that it both feared and expected where such a road might lead. In this sense, a new Napoleon has arisen in Germany, stands not only as a historical observation, but as a distilled expression of Europe's troubled relationship with power, memory, and the recurring allure of the extraordinary rule.